I'm Danielle Wood. I'm the CEO of the Grattan Institute. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands from which our speakers and our audience attend this webinar and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce Peter Achterstraat, the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner. Peter is both a lawyer and an economist by training, which is an excellent combination in my view. In addition to his role heading up the New South Wales Productivity Commission, he's also chair of the Bankstown Airport, president of the New South Wales Division of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and chair of the Sydney Financial Forum, among a few other things I just heard about. So he's a very busy individual. Peter and the New South Wales Productivity Commission have just released a green paper. It is a comprehensive blueprint for reform for the state of New South Wales, but it digs into so many different areas that are really important for New South Wales and the rest of the country, where state government decisions really make a difference for our wellbeing. Everything from schools and vocational education training, planning and infrastructure, to tax, to energy, to water. These are some of the big issues that we're going to be talking about, and these are really the things I think we should be emphasising when we look at how we can build back better after COVID. To help us unpack the report and its recommendations, I'm also joined by two Grattan program directors with expertise in some of these really important areas. First, Julie Sonneman is our acting school education program director. Brendan Coates is the director of our household finances program, and he's led Grattan's work on housing affordability and state tax reform. So welcome Julie and Brendan as well. So I'm going to kick off with Peter. Congratulations on the release of the green paper. It's a very substantial piece of work, one that sets out a big agenda for the New South Wales government. Can you spend a few minutes to kick us off just talking a little bit about the paper and what you were setting out to achieve?
Great, thanks very much, Danielle. Thanks for the opportunity to be able to say a few words and also to hear the line of questioning and some comments from people. But more importantly, thank you to Grattan for all the work you've done over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly in relation to driving productivity. Really do appreciate it. And we work hand in glove with Grattan. I've stolen some of your ideas, but apart from that, thanks very much. Well, I think as many people know, over the last 20 to 30 years, productivity has increased in Australia every year. So each year there's been more goods and services made per person than the year before over the last 20 to 30 years. But in the last 4 or 5 years, that rate of productivity growth has fallen. So when productivity goes up, living standards can go up and real wages can go up. But when productivity stabilises or falls, then there's downward pressure on real wages. And not only is productivity flatlining, last year it fell. Now we don't know what's going to happen this year. So even before the pandemic, productivity fell. So the New South Wales government said we need to find ways to improve productivity. In the past, the federal government has done most of the heavy lifting on productivity reform, loaded the dollar, reduced tariffs, tax reform, etc. Now it's up to the states. So the New South Wales government established the New South Wales Productivity Commission. I was giving ad hoc dribs and drabs ideas to Cabinet over the first year. That we've been there for 2 years, over the first year, and Cabinet, I was pleased to say, accepted every one of my recommendations that I put up. Then after a year, the Treasurer said, look, I want a white paper with a holistic approach to things, not just one idea, but a whole lot. And I said to the Treasurer, look, before I come up with a white paper which has all the solutions, I want to explain to people what the problems are. Because traditionally I've known when you come up with solutions, people say, well, what's the problem? So we used a 3-stage approach, a discussion paper which we issued, and we got lots of comments, including from Grattan. And with the discussion paper, we focused on a number of areas, and that led us to then, with all that input from people on the discussion paper, we've now produced the green paper. And the green paper covers 6 areas, covers schools, skills, water, electricity, tax, planning, regulation, and infrastructure. And there's a number of areas we haven't touched health, haven't touched a number of others. We've touched 6 major ones, and we've come up with recommendations. And we've had a lot of good feedback from people, and what we've tried to do is set out the problem and set out some facts, and then put other people's solutions in there. We've got 56 recommendations throughout the report. They're not final, and we want to test each of those 56. Are they the right ones? I'm not particularly wedded to all of them. Some of them I've got a soft spot for, but we want to test them. So that's a bit of an overview, and I'll just show 4 or 5 quick slides, Danielle, and then I'll be really keen to get some questions. So I'm not sure if you can see that that slide thing. No, you can't see it just yet. I'll just try again. Can you see that slide thing there, Danielle?
I can see that you're sharing a screen. Yeah, just come up now.
Okay, great. So I'll just go through very quickly. So we can see that productivity has been falling over the last few years, and now down the bottom there, it fell actually, it is negative 0.7. So we issued a discussion paper first, did a lot of consultation, now we've got the green paper. And we've had a lot of good response to the green paper, we're getting a lot of input, and we're hoping people will comment, so when we do our white paper, we can tease out which of the 56 recommendations we think are the best. We cover 7 areas. We cover schools, as I said, we cover vet, skills, regulation, we cover water and energy, infrastructure, planning, and state taxation. We have recommendations on each. So what we've done with each of them is we've set out the problem. So for example, with schools, we've said, look, the amount of spending in New South Wales has gone up per child over the last 15 years, but our results are falling. So that's the issue, the problem. And then we say a couple of comments, and then we put up some recommendations, and the main ones go around teacher quality and following through best practice. Similarly with vet, we say with vet, well, there's skill shortages in a number of areas, air conditioning, mechanics, chefs, pastry cooks, etc. There's a number of shortages. What can we do to fast track more people into trades? We then come up with recommendations. Similarly with regulation, we looked at the COVID regulations and said, look, New South Wales government has made all these regulatory changes during COVID. Which ones should we continue? Should we continue with supermarkets getting deliveries 24/7? Should we continue with pharmacists dispensing low-level prescriptions? And our key recommendations, we should retain every one of these temporary regulation relations for 12 months, assess how they're going. So rather than just stop them, we've got to keep them going. They've got to, it's if not, why not? Then we've got other regulatory reforms we're recommending, whether it be occupational mobility from various states, the single desk rice market over the in relation to agricultural drones, and a requirement that we can do everything electronically. Not all the recommendations I put out have been accepted by people. The drones one, I thought everyone would think it's a good idea, but we're getting feedback that people are not accepting that one. Now, what that is at the moment a farmer can only use a drone. This is, I think, recommendation 51. A farmer can only use a drone with line of sight. We're suggesting they should be able, if they're on 100, over 10,000 hectares, they should be able to use it even if there's no line of sight. I thought that was a good idea. The feedback we're getting is that people don't want that. Fair enough, we'll take that on board. Housing, New South Wales, the slowest approval times compared to any other state. We've got some recommendations in there on how we can improve that. With housing, while at the moment the shortage of housing supply is not as high as it has been, it's going to escalate if we don't do things. We also cover water and energy with a couple of recommendations there, and also infrastructure. Primarily with infrastructure, we're saying we should start building new developments where there is already trains and roads, etc. And then taxes, we're talking about a national payroll tax system. We're talking about lifting the rate capping, etc. So I guess that's a real whirlwind tour, Danielle, and I'll be happy to expand on any of those, but I just assumed people knew most of it, so that's why I went so quickly through it.
Fantastic, thank you. No, it's wonderful to get a high-level overview. I've had a question come in while you were speaking, Peter. I think this is a good one because it's something I think that a lot of people often want to ask, which is how do we actually measure productivity? What are we talking about here when we're talking about productivity?
Sure. Well, we've got multi-factor productivity and labour productivity. We're focusing on labour productivity, the amount of goods and services produced per person per hour. Now, we all know that in America, it takes them 4 days to produce the same level of goods that it takes 5 days in Australia. And that's probably, whereas in total we produce the same amount of goods. In Australia, we all work longer hours than most other countries. So you think, oh, we're just as productive. We're not. Per hour, we're not as productive as other countries.
Thank you. So obviously there's a number of topics covered by this report. We didn't feel we could probably do them all justice in just 1 hour. So we're going to do a sort of a deep dive into a few of them. So, we're particularly going to focus on education and skills, housing affordability, tax and regulatory reform. So I'm going to sort of shoot some questions to our panel members on each of these themes. And I also hope to bring in questions from the audience. So jump into that Q&A section and submit any questions that you might have, and I'll try and bring them out through the discussion. So starting with education, Peter, something that struck me is actually really important and different about this paper is that other than the sort of obligatory chapter about the importance of productivity, your first chapter was about teaching and schools. Why did you decide to start there?
Well, that was a deliberate choice, because I think that's the fundamental, the most important. I'll tell you why. In previous times in New South Wales, we've talked about asset recycling. So you've got an asset, poles and wires or whatever, let's recycle and make it work better. The theme of our paper is asset utilisation. Asset utilisation. We've got existing assets from both state-owned and private sector-owned. Let's use all those assets better. Now, we're not talking just physical assets, whether they be roads or shopping centres or whatever. They can be used better. They're empty half the time. Why don't we use them more often? We're not just talking physical assets. We're not just talking intellectual assets. There's a lot of data that is in business and in the government that can be used better. So we're not just talking physical assets or intellectual assets. We're talking human assets. And my firm belief is if we can get the Australian average worker improve their effectiveness, then that will go a long way to improve productivity. And we're focusing mainly, I guess, at the entry level into the workplace. So we're talking about schools and VET, or TAFE as we call it, and also maybe reskilling people mid-career. So a deliberate decision to focus on the people first, and then our subsequent chapters talk about physical assets, using roads better, spreading the usage, etc.
Fantastic. Julie, I might bring you in here because I know you were particularly happy to see that emphasis on education in the report. Why do you think the types of reforms that Peter's been talking about there are so important?
So I think the report points to a really big issue in schools where we've seen a long-term decline in our schooling outcomes over the last 20 years. So if you look at the international PISA tests, which is looking at problem solving of kids at the age of 15, we've seen declines in every subject area studied. So in reading, in maths and in science, and especially in maths. So we know that there is work to be done in schools, and that this will have long-term implications for productivity, as Peter's pointed to. I think what the report does, which is sets it apart from some of the other types of policy documents in this space, is that it uses words like evaluation and accountability, and really points to the use of evidence in schools. And this is really important because a lot of the time government policies tend to go very softly in the school sector. We talk a lot about building capacity and teacher professional learning, and accountability seems to be a bit of a dirty word. But I think when you look at professions that are complex, they do talk about professional accountability. You know, if you look at engineering and medicine and whatnot, and I do think we need to be looking at schools in the same way.
What does that actually look like, Julie? How do we actually create that accountability and implement that evidence-based practice you're talking about? And how do we stop that just being kind of an additional load on our stretched teachers?
So I think a big part of the puzzle that's missing, which the report points to, is really elevating expertise. So having a career pathway for expert teachers and specialists, and having them make the judgments and set the directions for teaching practice. And to me, that's the most important reform in the whole report, because you can't do evaluation and accountability if you're not really clear about what does good practice look like. And we've had a lot of very kind of vague documents that talk about good teaching practice, but what's missing is seriously getting into the specifics of that, and actually creating the workforce structures so that it's somebody's day job in schools to actually be setting these directions and monitoring it. So it's not just about more accountability on teachers themselves, I think, in this model. It's about having experts that they can turn to and get feedback from in their everyday teaching work. So then they're not doing additional things, they're getting feedback on how to do their work better. So that's very much the type of accountability that we'd like to see.
Fantastic. Another theme that was touched on in the education space was workforce supply shortages, particularly in areas like maths. What are your thoughts on that, Julie? Do you see that as a pressing issue?
So it's definitely a big issue in the near term. So given we've seen the big declines in maths, we know that there's a lot of unqualified teachers teaching maths at the moment. And I think the report points to a number of really practical ways of how we can try and address some of those supply issues. I think what it's symptomatic of is a deeper problem with people not wanting to go into teaching. And this comes back to some of the structures that we were talking about before. When you look at young high achievers today, so young people when they're making their career decisions, the biggest reasons why they're turning backs on teaching is around pay and around perception of career challenge, so that you just get stuck in the classroom and there's no opportunities to progress. So I think we should be looking at the immediate workforce shortages, but I also think we need to be keeping in mind that if we're to sort of tackle some of these bigger long-term issues, that we need to be thinking about reforms to the teacher pay structure. And that's not teacher pay at the bottom end, it's actually teacher pay at the top. We know that graduate pay is actually quite competitive with other professions, but it's when you get into your 40s, that's where people are being asked to make big trade-offs to join teaching compared to other professions.
Fantastic. Well, that's helpfully gone to a question that Greg Nichols has raised about how do we actually make the profession more attractive to high calibre people. Peter, your report sort of touches on that issue as well. You don't explicitly go to that question of pay that Julie's raised. Do you see that as part of the solution?
Well, look, before I answer the one on pay, I'll just finish off what Julie's point about this shortage of maths teachers. One of our specific recommendations is that, look, there are a number of people in their 40s who are in the finance industry in Sydney, and we know anecdotally they exist and they would like to become maths teachers. But why would they give up 4 years? They've got a mortgage to pay. Why would they go and study a dip ed and the Masters of Teaching for 4 years, then to become a teacher? So we're recommending these people, these finance professionals, they often know a lot about maths. In fact, quite a lot about maths. They know the hedge fund managers, whatever. So we're suggesting there be a way of truncating their training so that they can be fast-tracked into the maths teaching much quicker. They've still got to learn on how to be a teacher and how to get on with parents and whatever, but they could be fast-tracked in. So that's on the supply shortage. In relation to pay, you probably noticed most of my 56 recommendations don't involve a lot of government money. I'm not here to turn around and say the government should spend more on X, Y, Z. Some of them do, but I've tried to take an approach on making changes which won't rob other parts of the sector from areas. So we do, in relation to the teaching one, recognise exactly as Julie said, the entry-level pay is competitive. It flatlines compared to other countries. I think in New South Wales, you go from the minimum to the maximum in about 7 years or something. In other countries, there's more scope. So we do have one recommendation in there for a role called the instructional lead, which is because at the moment, if a teacher wants to earn above a certain amount of money, they have to leave the classroom and become a deputy principal or something like that, many of which don't teach. So we're suggesting that the role of an instructional lead be implemented. Someone who can be a high performing teacher, but also to give feedback to their peers.
Fantastic. Why don't we move to talking about skills and vocational education and training? And I think it's probably fair to say it's an area where a lot of people see that policy's fallen short in the last decade. Peter, can you highlight some of the challenges that you identified for the vocational education and training sector and give us a bit of a sense of what you think would work?
Right, okay. Well, look, first of all, a specific one because of COVID, and that is in New South Wales, to be an apprentice, you've got to be studying and have a job. Now, a lot of apprentices, etc., unfortunately, their roles they no longer have a job. We're suggesting that they can continue their apprenticeship just doing the academic side for a short-term period while they're not actually on the tools. So that's one specific recommendation. But I guess the two broader ones are, first of all, that there is a shortage of certain types of trades. We've found anecdotally that if a boy or girl's parents were in the trade, then they will either join a trade or go to university. If a boy or girl's parents have been to university, they all tend to want to go to university. I'm generalising. So what it means is that the supply of people going into trades gets smaller every year, because those who might traditionally, now that's all anecdotal, but there is a reduced supply. So we're suggesting that there should be ways that people, and there's shortages, as I've mentioned before, in a number of areas. There's real skill shortages. So what we're suggesting is that people who were in their early 20s or their late teens, traditionally they can't become an apprentice because they've got to be paid too much and the course takes too long. We're suggesting that there should be ways to, instead of doing a 4-year apprenticeship, it should be done in 2 years. Now, there are pros and cons to that. There are a group of people that says, look, if you want to be a really good qualified tradesperson, you do have to spend the whole 4 years. And so we're absorbing all that feedback before we make our final recommendations on that. But also there is this perception that by default you should go to university. That may be the case for many people, but I think if we can just allow people to see the opportunities in the trade, you start your own business, etc. I think we've got to educate, advise the community more on
that. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting observation in the report about sort of it feeling like the default pathway for people that go through the HSC. Julie, what did you think about that recommendation that we sort of create these new pathways for HSC graduates into the trades?
Yeah, it seems like it's definitely needed. Our own work at Grattan has shown that, just what you were saying, Peter, about there's an assumption that if you go to university, that will automatically lead to higher incomes over your lifetime. Whereas actually, if you look at students who do get low ATARs at the end of school, often some would be better off actually doing a diploma of construction or engineering or commerce compared to their university options. And we know that there have been a lot of low ATAR students who go on to university in humanities and science who actually would have been better off from an earnings perspective, not going to university. So I think these are really live choices that young people should be encouraged to think seriously about.
Peter, you touched on sort of the role of COVID in your vet recommendations before. We've had an interesting question come in from Jake Curtis, who's asking about the current upheaval to immigration and whether that changes any of your key recommendations. I was thinking it may feed in, particularly in this skills space. Have you given any thought to how that's going to impact some of these considerations?
Look, in relation to the skills-based, no, the short answer is I haven't addressed the issue of immigration in the report. That's not one of the 6 areas we've looked at. But clearly, a reduction in the supply of skilled labour means we've got to enhance our own labour. We do have recommendations in there in relation to recognising the trades in the other states. At the moment, I think if you're a gyp rocker in one state, you can't necessarily work in another state. So we've got a recommendation in there that there be greater acceptance of others from around Australia. Haven't specifically talked about the 459 visas or something, things like that. We haven't addressed that.
Okay. Why don't we move on to planning? And I can see there's already questions coming in. So this is obviously one of those areas that always generates a lot of interest, and there's certainly it's a challenging policy area because different considerations come into play. Brendan, I'll bring you in here because you've worked a lot in this space. Do you think of planning in this way as a productivity issue?
Thanks, Tony. Yes, absolutely. I think planning is probably the biggest lever that state governments have to boost productivity, and probably the one that has been less appreciated or less researched over the course of the last few decades, because the system varies from state to state. The very nature of the economic institutions that normally drive the productivity reform agenda, the discussion about what we should do, have tended to be national. So we've had a National Productivity Commission. It's kind of tried to get into these areas, but then, and reflecting my own experience at Grattan, is when you start to talk about the planning systems, they vary a lot from state to state, and the details really matter. So I think it's really important and valuable to have an organisation like the New South Wales Productivity Commission in the game here, because it's actually getting further into the details of the particular reforms you need to see at a state level. Now, the reason it matters is because geography matters to economic activity. So we've seen, the rise of the services economy in Australia. We've seen the clustering of different firms and employees in our major cities. Those agglomeration scale economies are really large. And we know that the planning system plays a big role in determining those land uses and governing those respective land uses. And that has a big impact on ultimately how businesses act and how households act. And so what that essentially means is that we've seen studies around the world say there's a really large impact on productivity if you get this wrong. So research out of the US says that something like 2 to 13%, GDP could be 2 to 13% higher if enough housing had been built in those places with really strong jobs growth, say New York and San Francisco. And what we've instead seen is that we've pushed people more to the fringes of our cities because we've made it harder to build closer in. Now, planning has an important role to play. It manages these externalities in the land use planning process, or land use in the respective land uses. But the evidence tends to suggest that it's probably the costs of those particular prescriptive rules are larger than the benefits, and therefore there's big opportunities for reform there.
Fantastic. Now, Peter, you touched in your introduction on the relatively poor performance of the New South Wales system. We've had a question from Nikki Hutley, who also knows a lot about this space, making a similar point. What do you actually recommend in the report to address this? And Nikki's question is, what do you think will be the catalyst for real change?
Okay, look, I'll just nail my flag to the mast, and that is I'm a believer for better housing, affordability, etc. It's the supply that should be increased rather than finding ways to increase the demand by giving bits of money to people to buy. So I'll just let you know that's my intention where I'm coming from. I do agree with Brendan that, and in fact, a lot of our submissions on the discussion paper centred around planning. Key worker accommodation, for example, the productivity there, if you've got a bushfire in an expensive part of the city and all the people the health professionals and the firefighters live 3 hours away, it's not very effective for them to get there. So we want to find ways where we can make key worker housing more affordable. Two parts to it. First one is in relation to speeding up the development process. That in itself is not really a huge productivity gain. It is a productivity gain if we can do it quicker. Much quicker, because you don't have the capital sitting around and the dollars and that and the uncertainty. So it is a productivity gain. But I think, to take Brendan's point, more importantly is the strategic approach to the planning. Is everything in the right place, etc. And a key recommendation we've got there is in relation to the number of planning zones. At the moment, New South Wales has 2 or 3 times as many zones as Victoria. And so if you want to change from selling XYZ to selling ABC, you've got to go and get all these approvals, whereas if we could maybe have a broader group on that. Another area which became too big for our green paper, Danielle, was developer contributions. It is a huge topic, so the government has asked me to do a specific report on that. So we've taken that out of the green paper, and I'm doing a major report on the level of contributions that a developer has to make to both the local government and the state government when they choose to do a development, whether it be a greenfield, an old orange orchard being converted to 100 houses, or it be an infill near a railway station. So that is a major bit of work I'm doing. We're hoping to release a report on that towards the end of the year.
Brendan, Peter's declared himself as a supply side guy when it comes to housing affordability. Are you a supply side guy? Do you think the recommendations in the report will help with affordability? And what else do you think should go into the mix when we're talking about that issue?
I think we all recognise the supply side's a big part of the story. It's not the whole story, but it is a big part of the story when it comes to housing affordability, and also where people get to choose to live. It's not just the price that they're paying for the dwelling, but whether they're living in the kind of suburb that they really want to, that's close to amenities, close to jobs, or whether they're in fact living further out and then having to commute in, which has its own costs. So I think the reforms that Peter's outlined in the report will certainly make a big difference. So making the planning system more flexible, that if that allows greater density, should that be what people still want in a post-COVID world, would make a big difference. And certainly it's consistent with Grattan's work that suggests that one of the big constraints is that people are wanting to live, if they're asked to trade off price versus location, size of dwelling, there is more of a preference to live in the inner ring suburbs of our major cities in Sydney and Melbourne, and that the housing stock does not reflect that. And so that's a cost that is being imposed on people. The part where I think the report probably could have gone further is the report sets out quite sensibly that councils should essentially be held accountable for the housing supply targets that have been set by the Greater Sydney Commission. The report acknowledges that the councils have not always met those targets in the past, and therefore, as a city as a whole, Sydney hasn't necessarily met those targets. The challenge, I think, is about what we do to enforce those rules, because the fundamental problem here is one of political economy. So local councils reflect the views of those that live in the area. That's what they are as a democratically elected government. And those that would move into the area over time, if more housing is built, they don't get a vote. And that's the challenge, I think, that we're trying to overcome, particularly with relatively fragmented local governments that we see in New South Wales and Sydney. And here you need sticks and carrots. Now, New South Wales has already used some of the sticks in essentially taking some of the planning controls or approvals away from the councils when they are larger medium density developments. And we've seen that that's it's contributed to a big increase in the amount of developments that we're seeing over the last few years. The question is whether they could be doing more. And I think the big carrot probably is to use something like the potential windfall, or the windfall gains that we get in the planning system, as a tax on zoning uplift, as a betterment tax that can be shared amongst councils that then meet their obligations. So you've got to basically give those that have a veto power over the system at the moment some way of either pushing them into doing what's right for the community as a whole, or to reward them if they in fact take those right steps. And I think I'm really interested in the work Peter's doing on infrastructure contributions, because I think a lot of that debate about infrastructure contributions is a de facto debate in part around the zoning value, the value in the that's generated by the planning system, whether that could be captured better.
Well, I think that, if I can interrupt, I think that's a very good point, Brendan. And we haven't covered that value capture or the betterment issue to the extent that the feedback we're getting is a lot stronger than what we put in our report. So it confirmed, what I'm hearing is confirming your view that let's give some consideration to this value capture concept. I think, was it Winston Churchill that once said, look, landlords, etc., or owners of buildings can make a lot of money when there's a railway station built next to them without any extra work. So maybe they should help contribute to the cost of the railway station. I'm not suggesting I agree with Mr. Churchill, but that's the sort of feedback. And that's the beauty of going green paper than white paper. So we're getting this rich discussion on value capture and betterment levies, and confirms what you're saying. Thanks.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's move on to my personal favourite topic of tax. So the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner report, like that of the New South Wales Federal Financial Review report, which is sort of running parallel, and like many other reports before it, recommends replacing stamp duties with a broad-based land tax. Brendan, why is this always at the top of everyone's state tax reform list, and what's been standing in the way?
Well, Danny, stamp duty, I think, is well recognised as being perhaps the most costly tax that the states levy. It does, to tread a well-worn path of economists over the course of the last couple of decades. The description essentially is that it impedes people from choosing to live where they'd want to live and taking jobs that they might otherwise take. It impedes them from upsizing their home. Look, I can speak from personal experience. In the middle of COVID, I'd be very tempted to live in a larger home while we're living at home. I haven't seen the office since February with 2 small kids at home. COVID, stamp duty prevents those sort of transfers from taking place. It's a tax on mobility. I think something that's less talked about is it's also it does do a lot to distort the way that firms structure their assets as well and who owns what. So the classic example is always that Australia Post doesn't own any of its post offices or the land underneath them. They're owned by small mum and pop businesses because that's a way of managing that process. But so the challenge here is that you can get a really big economic gain if you replace stamp duty with a broad-based land tax. We estimate it could be up to $5 billion a year. The reason that it doesn't happen is because stamp duties are not a very salient tax. It's built into the design of the it's built into the transaction of which when you're buying a house or funding some big asset. Whereas land tax is very salient. You get this bill every quarter or every year that's really obvious to you, and obviously you get very frustrated when you're fronting up with a bill for $1,000, admittedly on an asset that may be worth $500,000 or $1 million. And land taxes themselves are a very efficient tax because they don't change people's land use, the way in which people choose to use land. So they don't change people's incentives to work, save and invest. The challenge, of course, as well has been the transition. It's been very hard to make the shift. Only the ACT government has managed to do that to date. They have moved over the course of a 20-year period from they're partway through that process from land tax, from stamp duty to land tax. It's hard for other states to imagine doing that over a really long period of time. It's hard to imagine they'll be able to solve the political problems around recent purchasers who have recently purchased a home and don't want to pay land tax after having paid stamp duty, those that are asset rich and income poor, and also to maintain tax revenues during the transition. Because if you pay stamp duty $60,000, say, or $50,000 on the average house, in, say, somewhere like Sydney, then you're instead getting the land tax gradually over time. And that can cause big problems with the state government's revenues if they give a lot of giveaways to solve those other political problems in the process.
Does COVID shift in any way the challenges or the thinking around that transition, Brendan?
I think COVID shifts it in a couple of ways. One, I think it makes the reform more necessary. Because you're going to see a big structural change in the economy as a result of COVID. We're already seeing that in the CBDs of our major cities. I've been really struggling during this period. A lot of people are working from home. We think people will probably work from home for longer. Despite everything the government's done at both the federal and state level, you are going to see further a lot of business failures and a need to restructure. Recessions tend to accelerate structural change. So that's why you need that shift from a stamp duty to a land tax to allow those to facilitate that structural change. I think on the politics of the transition, the interesting thing is normally when we're trading off the elements in that transition, the one that's typically been the constraint is governments can't afford to fund a really big transition package because the politics of budget surpluses at the state level is very powerful. Now, every state government is running very large budget deficits. And at that point, is it such a big issue to pour another $1 billion of transition measures on top into that hole? Will you really hear it hit the bottom, frankly? And so there might be more scope for state governments, ironically in the middle of the recession because of the politics of budgets, to provide more supports via credits for recent purchases, tax holidays, to allow that transition to take place faster than otherwise would, acknowledging that the budget positions of the states are not going to get back to surplus anytime soon.
It would certainly be nice to come out the other side of this with a sort of a longer term reform to show for it. Peter, while we're still on tax, the report had a suggestion, certainly that I hadn't seen before, which was that the Board of Treasurers, which is both the state and federal treasurer that meet regularly, establish a single cross-state body to coordinate a consistent approach to administering payroll tax systems. Why do you think we should go down that path, and what would that actually look like?
Look, it's one that I'm very keen on, Danielle, and I'll just explain. In New South Wales, for example, there's just over 50,000 payroll taxpayers, so they're medium to larger business, and nearly half of those, about 40% of those, also pay payroll tax in another state. Now, the rules are different in each state. The definition of contract is different, definition of employee is different. There's all sorts of different administrative roles. Some of the computer software systems for small or medium-sized businesses don't have a payroll tax element to it because they've got to do a different one for every state. So what our recommendation is, or the recommendation in the report, is that why don't we have just one single payroll tax act, the same definition across the country for employee, the same timeframes, the same due dates, the same agreements to pay, but each state can have their own different threshold and different rate. Just as in America, where the IRS often collects the income tax for each state and each city. Now, it can be done. People say, oh, the states won't get together. It can be done. The first homeowner grant, which is administered by each of the states, the 7,000 or whatever it is, one computer system, one set of legislation, and each state just has a few tweaks around the edges, but it's all administered nationally, even though it is a state function. And I believe the same can be done with payroll tax, and we can leave each state to keep their own thresholds and rates.
I think I can hear a lot of small business owners, or medium-sized business owners, I should say, cheering at that proposal. Let's move now and talk about innovation. Through the report, Peter, you talk a little bit about technological innovation and driving productivity. And you certainly note that to try and drive that type of innovation, sometimes governments adopt pro-innovation strategies like tax incentives or subsidies. Industry clusters is another big one. Why didn't you go in that direction in your report? And what do you think state governments should be doing to support innovation?
Great, thanks, Danielle. And it's not a conscious decision not to go there. We focused on the 6 areas in our report: schools, skills, infrastructure, etc. A number of issues we didn't look at, including innovation, because there is also an innovation strategy which is being run in other parts of the New South Wales government. They're running with that. Similarly, with all the points Brendan made on the tax, the land tax stamp duty, I won't be taking much of a driving force on that now, because the FFR review doing that. So my 56 recommendations, or 55 or whatever, is enough to keep me busy. Now, the innovation, I'm quite comfortable there is another group looking at that. It may well be, if the white paper is successful and gets recommendations up and running, we will have white paper number 2, and then that will include areas such as health. Mental health particularly is an area for productivity gain. There are a lot of people working on that. That's why we didn't cover that. We would be able to do justice compared to what other people are. Similarly with innovation.
Okay, thank you. Well, that hopefully, William Hollier, that answers your question. William's concerned about the fact that US has developed so many major innovations: flight, transistors, computers, human genome, space, but Australia's lagging behind in technological innovation. Brendan, obviously there's some more prosaic, maybe, forms of innovation that have taken place, but nonetheless very important forms of innovation that have taken place. During COVID, we've seen businesses have to switch up their processes in very short timeframes, huge amount of retail service businesses moving their offerings online. What do you think have been the lessons for policymakers about supporting innovation that have emerged from this period?
Thanks, Danny. Well, look, I think we've seen businesses be very creative in how they've responded to COVID. So a huge shift online in many sectors, especially in retail. And a lot of these things I suspect will start to endure after the crisis because they've been in place long enough. And I speak as a Victorian, so we've been, living this probably in a slightly different way for longer than a lot of people in other states. And that will in fact itself be interesting to see how that plays out in time, whether you see more of a shift to online in Victoria because we've been doing it for longer. But I think what's been really critical is the way in which the governments have actually supported businesses. So the very design of, say, JobKeeper, for example, has facilitated more innovation, I suspect, in Australia than perhaps you would have seen in other countries. So comparing, say, to the UK, where they've had the furlough scheme, where you only get the wage subsidy if you put your employers on furlough. In Australia, you get to retain access to your staff, even so you get the subsidy even if they're still working. And that's essentially given businesses a subsidy to think about reinventing their businesses so that any additional revenue they get, is a bonus for them because they're getting the wage subsidy anyway. And you've seen that in the way that firms have responded with a big shift to online. A lot of restaurants who otherwise probably would have just furloughed everyone and said, that's it, we'll wait until September until we can reopen again, or December, and go from there. So I think that's been one big advantage. I think we've also accepted that some of the cost of some of these regulations that Peter mentioned before, things like the restrictions of when deliveries can be made to supermarkets, the way in which pharmacists can dispense medicines. We've shifted those because the costs of not allowing those regulations went through the roof. And so it's kind of broken the back of the political economy against changing them. And I suspect we'll actually see some of those regulations were actually, the changes we've made actually stay in place. So I think government needs to be flexible in supporting businesses. So when we're thinking about the next phase of this, it's probably going to involve a lot more outdoor dining. It's probably changes to liquor laws to allow, hospitality sectors to keep functioning in a world where we're living with COVID and where COVID is still a risk in the community, and therefore we need to manage its spread. And I think we can hope that government can to look at those changes that we've made and keep as many of them as we can. Because I think that will drive productivity growth in the long run and will be better for it.
Yeah, I've certainly been in touch with a few of the local governments in Melbourne that are thinking about exactly these sort of things. And I think they're aware that now's the time to be flexible because this innovation is so important. Julie, obviously innovation wasn't limited to business. We saw both schools and teachers having to adapt and innovate in very short timeframes. What do you think was learnt from that process, and what do you think we might want to keep on the other side of this?
Yeah, so I think, I think our teachers have adapted amazingly well for the remote schooling. And I think what that's shown policymakers is that, there is this perception that shifting teaching practice is just really difficult. We've been trying to do it for a long period of time. It's just, people are really stuck in their ways. Actually, sometimes when given the right structures and a different routine, people can shift practice very quickly. So I think it shows for policymakers it is possible. I think some of the key things to take away, I think we've, there's been some really interesting innovations in teacher time use, so that teachers have been using more shared resources, and standardisation is an issue that does need to be looked at in teachers' work. Currently, teachers do a lot of reinventing of the wheel themselves, and that's the system we've created for them without giving them adequate guidance. So there's been a lot more use of things like structured literacy programs or structured sort of maths programs where the scope and sequencing has been well thought through by experts who put it together. And, some private schools, for example, have been reporting that they actually think their younger students have learnt to read better during remote schooling because they've been using some of these online well-scoped and sequenced programs. So I think that's one big takeaway. And then I think the other is obviously around digital learning. So, teachers and students are now far more comfortable with it than ever before. So we can keep building on that. But I think we need to be realistic that we're yet to see any really strong evidence in terms of evaluations showing that that's always a better way to learn. So I think it's just, making use of the skills that teachers and students now have and cautiously sort of piloting digital learning in the classroom when schools reopen.
Thanks. So let's move to the question of where to from here. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about prioritisation. We actually put out a report yesterday that was really talking about how difficult it can be for governments, given a sort of a list of really worthwhile reforms, to sort of pick the ones given limited resources, given you've only got so much political capital, ministerial time, public attention, bandwidth in the public service. So the report was by our former CEO, John Daly, and he advanced a framework that was really looking at two dimensions. One, how valuable is the reform? How much does it actually do to improve things that we care about, whether that's material well-being or health or education or public safety, and how feasible is it? What's the strength of the evidence base? How strong is the opposition going to be? How complex is the implementation? And really the key message from that report was that governments should focus on delivering a small number of high-value, feasible reforms. Peter, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Do you agree with that as a proposition? And if governments were going to bring that framework to this report, where would you like them to start?
Great. And look, congratulations on that report that came out the other day. And I like the quote in it from one Prime Minister to the other. I think something along the lines of, stop worrying, stop trying to solve problems like the street name in Timbuktu, just focus on 3 or 4 really big issues. And a couple of Prime Ministers, I think, had that discussion. That was good. Look, I couldn't agree more that we've got to focus on issues. However, I would say I'd prefer to see 4 small reforms implemented quickly than 10 big reforms sitting on the shelf for 5 years. And so the smaller ones sometimes tend to get momentum. And we've seen that during the pandemic. Some of the smaller initiatives, people are building off each one, whereas if you'd started with the final one, they might have said, no way. But if bits and pieces. So yes, I completely agree with prioritisation. Let's focus on a few, get them done. We've only focused on the 6 areas in our report. Obviously, I'm looking through some of the questions here. There's 100 other topics we've got to look at. We're focusing on 6, and hopefully we'll get them done. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a bit of a balancing act between the sort of the small, doable, easier wins and the sort of the big changes. Brendan, if you were using that criteria and looking at this report, where would you start?
Well, Danny, I think the one I'd start with is the one that Peter is delegating in part to the Federal Financial Relations Review, which is, I think, the stamp duty property tax swap. I think that's we're closer now to that reform in New South Wales than I think we have been at any time in the past decade. COVID gives that extra impetus for reform. As far as it being a large reform, we're talking about a substantial boost to, state GSP. We're talking about an improvement in housing affordability and where people get to choose to live. And I think in the long term, it's going to matter a lot because the sustainability of the tax base is going to be a challenge. COVID means state governments, New South Wales is no exception, have spent an enormous amount of money correctly trying to insulate firms and households from their direct costs of COVID. That money has been well spent, and if without it, we'd be in a much worse position than we are. But it is unclear about what the long-term growth trajectory of the state is and what the long-term fiscal trajectory is as well. Now, we know from intergenerational reports, New South Wales again has been a front runner amongst the states and actually doing those reports before the other states. There are long-term budget challenges, and a land tax, a broad-based property tax that is built on land values, which tend to rise faster over time than state income, would be a really good way to go. Would be a much better way of funding state revenues. It would be much more equitable. So that's the one I'm going to go with, I think, is the number one. Just to quickly responding to Peter's comment about prioritisation, small versus big reforms, I think the way I think about it is that if you're the central agency, so if you're the Premier's office, then prioritising the big reform is the right way to go because you only do 1 or 2 of them in a term. And it seems that the Treasurer in particular has been thinking about 1 or 2 big reforms. If I'm the agencies that are not at the centre or locus of power and I'm not having to harness that same level of resourcing to do some of these smaller things, and I think Peter's right that some of the smaller reforms, there's no reason you can't do them as well. In our framework, I think we'd probably describe that, Danny, as delegation. You're delegating that to the Minister to go forth and do rather than the Premier and the Treasurer standing up and making it the centrepiece of their economic statement.
Exactly right. Now, Julie, since I've asked everyone else, I'll give you the chance for the same question. If you were to have a look at this report, what would be the 1 or 2 that you would really love to see get up?
I think the use of greater recognition of expert teachers and giving them more responsibility for setting up the accountability, setting the directions for the workforce. I feel like it's obviously it's high value, but it's also feasible. So we know it's already happening to some degree. It just needs to be taken up 5 notches, which means that the will is there. So it's just a matter of executing it better. And also the unions are on board at this point in time. So they've moved a long way in terms of recognising that different teachers can be paid more if they're given extra responsibilities. So I think the time is right. And I take Peter's point about extra funds, but I actually think this is relatively cheap in the scheme of things because you're talking about extra pay for potentially 5% of teachers. And so it's actually not a hugely expensive reform, and it would make a big difference.
Thank you. And Peter, I'll just finish with the question about what do you think the appetite for change is? You've delivered this report. Do you think COVID has helped or hindered the appetite for doing big things?
Well, I think we've got a two-edged sword on this one, Danielle. I see the appetite over the last 6 months has been very strong for reform. The community and administrators, I think, are crying out for reform because they see the need for it. As we've mentioned earlier, they're allowing chemists to dispense certain prescriptions. In Sydney, people are allowing building to happen on a Saturday morning, even though it might disturb their sleep in. They never used to allow that before. People are allowing electronic signatures, which were never allowed before. So there is a real appetite during this period. What I do fear, though, is that that window will close within the next 6 months. What I feel is that, or my worry, is that if I don't act quickly, I've lost the opportunity. Why do I say that? At the moment, when things normalise a little bit, I'm not suggesting they'll ever normalise, but when they normalise a little bit, I think balance sheets will be very stretched. I think business balance sheets, they're spending a lot of money on survival. Business balance sheet, household balance sheets, again stretched in many cases where people have been deferring payments, etc. And government balance sheets, very, very stretched. When you have a stretched balance sheet, there's intrinsically, my experience is there's a withdrawal back to the status quo. And people are concerned about any new initiatives, any changes. So to answer your question, yes, there is. I believe the appetite is stronger now than it has been for a long time, but that appetite could quite quickly dissipate if we don't take action.
Well, there you go, a call to arms to finish up. So can I just say a huge thank you to our very engaged audience for joining us today. Thank you for your brilliant questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get all of them. Certainly demand for additional sessions on infrastructure and road user charging and health if the comments are anything to go by. I want to say thank you as well to the New South Wales State Library for the ongoing relationship with Grattan, to the New South Wales Productivity Commission for serving up plenty of food for thought, and of course to our fantastic speakers, to Peter, Brendan and Julie. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. If you would like to see the New South Wales Productivity Commission Green Paper, please go to their website. Similarly, if you'd like to find out more about Grattan, please go to grattan.edu.au and sign up for our newsletter while you're there. Thanks again, everyone, and hopefully see you soon.